Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 4.2b. I've entitled this video, Compromises, Compromises. This video is going to cover pages 206 to 209. Disagreements over a new government. Soon after the meeting began, the delegates realized they would have to do more than simply revise the Articles of Confederation. They chose instead to write an entirely new constitution for the nation. They disagreed, however, about the form the new national government should take. Virginia proposes a plan. Edmund Randolph and James Madison, both from Virginia, proposed a plan for the new government. This Virginia plan called for a strong national government with 3 branches that would be responsible for different tasks. Each would keep the others from growing too powerful. Under the Virginia plan, the legislature would consist of 2 houses. The number of representatives would be based on population. Thus, in both houses, larger states would have more representatives than smaller ones. Small states opposed the Virginia plan. They feared that the large states could easily outvote them in Congress. Supporters of the Virginia plan replied that it was only fair for a state with more people to have more representatives. So now we can answer a couple questions. Question number 1 on the worksheet. Under the Virginia plan, how many branches of government would there be? There would be 3 branches of government. Question 2. Under the Virginia plan, how many houses would the legislative branch have? There would be 2 houses. Question 3. Under the Virginia plan, how would representatives be decided? Representation would be decided based on the population of the state. Question 4. Why were the smaller states opposed or against the Virginia plan? Well, they were afraid because they didn't have a lot of population that they would simply be outvoted on every issue because the large states would have more representatives, therefore the large states would get their way every time. Question 5. Why did supporters of the Virginia plan feel representatives should be based on the population of the states? Well, they thought that was only fair. Hey, a whole concept of representative government is that the people are represented by representatives. If my state has more people, I deserve to have more representatives. So it was a very common sense argument that they were making. New Jersey's proposal. After 2 weeks of debate, William Paterson of New Jersey presented a plan that had the support of the small states. Like the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan called for 3 branches of government. However, it provided for a legislature that had only 1 house. Each state, regardless of its population, would have 1 vote in the legislature, just as it had under the Articles of Confederation. Question 6. Under the New Jersey plan, how many branches of government would there be? There would once again be 3 branches of government, so both plans agreed on that concept. Question 7. Unlike the Virginia plan, how many houses would the legislative branch have in the New Jersey plan? There would be 1 house. Question 8. Under the New Jersey plan, how would representation be decided? It would be very simple. Equal representation. Each state, 1 vote. Equal vote for every state. The Great Compromise. For a while, no agreement could be reached. Tempers flared. The convention seemed ready to fall apart. Finally, Roger Sherman of Connecticut worked out a compromise. A compromise, a solution in which each side gives up some of its demands to reach an agreement. Question number 9. This is a thinking question. The book doesn't really say exactly, so I want you to think about this one before I give you the answer. Why do you think the textbook mentioned that, quote, tempers flared, the convention seemed ready to fall apart? The reason they told you that is because, our great country with this constitution that has run longer than any other country's constitution in the world currently, it almost didn't even get off the ground. At this point, with all the frustrations of the members, remember, the tempers were flaring because it's hot. They're wearing those heavy suits that they wear. The windows are closed. People are thinking about how they make their money, their economies. And sometimes people get upset when it comes to people messing with their money or their way of life. And so I think the book wants to remind you that had cooler heads not prevailed, we might not have the government we have today. You and I might not be talking about the American form of government right now. Question 10, What does the word compromise mean? A compromise is a solution in which each side gets a little and gives a little. In other words, they give up some of their demands in order to reach an agreement. Sherman's Compromise called for the creation of a two-house legislature. Members of the lower house, called the House of Representatives, would be elected by popular vote. As the larger states wished, seats would be awarded to each state based on population. Members of the upper house, called the Senate, would be chosen by state legislatures. Each state, no matter what its size, would have 2 senators. Small states particularly liked this part of Sherman's Compromise. On July 16th, the delegates narrowly approved Sherman's plan. It became known as the Great Compromise. Each side, in an admirable show of civic virtue, gave up some demands to achieve unity. With a margin of just 1 vote, the delegates had found a peaceful solution to a problem that had threatened to bring the convention to a halt. Question number 11. Summarize Roger Sherman's Great Compromise. Well, he took parts of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. He took the 2-house legislature, so that was in from both sides. But then one of those houses of legislature, the representation would be based on population, just like the Virginia plan wanted. And then in the other house of legislature, called the Senate, each state would have equal vote no matter what their population. And that's still the system that we have today. That's why every state has a varying amount of representatives. For example, Illinois has more representatives than Wyoming, but Wyoming has the same number of representatives as our most populated state, California. And that's because of the Great Compromise. Now let's move on to question number 12. What name was given to Roger Sherman's Compromise due to its importance? It was called the Great Compromise. Question 13. What does the phrase civic virtue mean? It doesn't mention it here, so I put that on the screen for you. So civic virtue is when someone has a standard of morality or a standard of how they can be a good person, how they can exhibit a positive, good way of their behavior. For example, things like voting, volunteering, attending a parent-teacher association meeting. These are all ways that you can show civic virtue, ways that you can behave in a way that helps society. Question 14. Well, how did the delegates of the Constitutional Convention demonstrate this civic virtue? Well, both sides had things they didn't want to give up, but they did so to form the Great Compromise so that we could have the government that we still have today. The 3/5 Compromise. Just as there were disagreements between large states and small states, there were also disagreements between the northern states and the southern states. The most serious disagreements concerned slavery. Would enslaved people be counted as part of a state's population? Would the slave trade continue to bring enslaved Africans into the United States? Question 15. There were disagreements between the states with larger populations and the states with smaller populations at the convention. There were also geographical disagreements between the states. Which 2 sections fought, and what was the main reason they were fighting? The 2 main sections of states geographically that fought were the northern states and the southern states. And the main reason they were fighting? Slavery. The states reach an agreement. Southerners wanted to include enslaved people in their state's population counts because that would give southern states more representatives in the House of Representatives. Southern states stood to gain greatly if enslaved people were counted. Extra representatives meant additional influence. Northerners objected. They argued that since enslaved people could not vote, they should not be counted when assigning representatives. Once again, the delegates compromised. They agreed that, and this is going to seem very weird in 2021, but they agreed that 3/5 of the enslaved people in any state would be counted. In other words, if a state had 5,000 enslaved residents, 3,000 of them would be included in the state's population count. This agreement became known as the 3/5 Compromise. The fraction in the 3/5 Compromise had come from a rule about taxes in the Articles of Confederation. The new compromise balanced the concerns of Northerners and Southerners. Question 16. Why did Southerners want to count their enslaved people in their state's population counts? Well, very clearly, power, power, power. If you can have more people in your population, then that gives you more representatives, and more representatives means you have more influence in the certain legislative branch. In this case, the House of Representatives. Question 17. Why did Northerners object to the Southerners counting enslaved people in their state's population counts? We're like, wait a minute, you can't have it both ways. Are these people or are they not? Now, as we know, of course, enslaved people were people. But Southerners were not treating them as people, they were treating them as property. And yet they were trying to have it both ways and counting them as people only for this population count. Northerners like, wait a minute, that makes no sense. Question 18. Summarize the 3/5 compromise. Well, in order to get the convention to continue, the North and South agreed that for counting population, an enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person. And here we see an infograph that shows you some of the ideas that went into the 3/5 compromise, some of the statistics. If you want to, feel free to pause the video at this point so you can take a look at this a little bit longer. Further disagreement over slavery. By 1787, some northern states had banned the slave trade within their borders. Delegates from these states urged that the importation of slaves be banned in the entire nation. Southerners argued that such a ban would ruin their economy. In the end, northern and southern states compromised once more. Northerners agreed that Congress could not outlaw the slave trade for at least 20 years. After that, Congress could regulate the slave trade if it wished. Northerners also agreed that no state could stop a person fleeing slavery from being returned to an owner. This clause in the Constitution became known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. The compromises, however, also brought up an ethical question. How could the nation's ideals of freedom, liberty, and democracy be adopted alongside slavery? Question number 19. The northern states and southern states compromised again over the slave trade. What did the North get out of the deal? Well, what the North got out of the deal is that in 20 years, they thought that perhaps they could outlaw the slave trade then. So yes, it got pushed off 2 decades, but in the Northerners' viewpoint, they thought, well, we'll have more people, so over time we'll have more influence in the House of Representatives, and eventually we can get this to pass, that we can outlaw slavery. So they got the promise that in 2 decades, there was a good chance that they might be able to get rid of slavery. On question 20, what did the South get out of the deal? Well, number one, it got put off for 20 years, so they procrastinated. Maybe some of you put off or procrastinate your homework. Well, they put it off for 20 years, so that meant they could make money off of slavery for 20 more years. And back then, people only lived to, they didn't live as long as we do. So for them, 20 years was a long time, and that was enough time to generate wealth and income that they could pass on down to their children. Also, what the South got was that fugitive slave clause, that the North agreed that if a slave escaped to the North, the Northerners said, yes, we understand that you have to have that slave returned to you. So that was a big deal for the South as well. And you'll find that out next year in 7th grade, just how big that was. Question 21. What does the word ethical mean? So this wasn't explained here in the material, so I put that on the side. So ethical or ethics, that's a code of moral standards of conduct for what is, quote, good and right, as opposed to what is bad and wrong. So thinking to yourself, yeah, this is the right thing to do, this is something that was brought up with slavery. Like, how can you have a society where we're all guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet you have a group of enslaved people that are denied all of those things? And so how can you, in your brain, make that work? Question 22, I just mentioned that. What was the biggest ethical question facing the United States after the compromises? How can you have a society that preaches freedom, liberty, and democracy on one hand, and on the other hand, whipping a slave with a whip? I mean, that doesn't make sense. Those two things do not make ethical sense. They don't even make common sense. The convention comes to a conclusion. After a long summer full of struggle and argument, the Constitution was ready to be signed on September 17th, 1787. Its opening lines, or preamble, express the goals of the framers. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Had they succeeded in carrying out the ideals of the Declaration of Independence? History's judgment has largely agreed that they did. As the delegates gathered for the last time, Benjamin Franklin rose and said, primary source, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would with me, on this occasion, doubt a little of its own infallibility and put his name to this instrument. Something he also said on the right here, I love this story. On the final day, as the last delegates were signing the document, Franklin pointed toward the sun on the back of the convention president's chair, as you can see here pictured. Observing that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their arts a rising sun from a setting sun, he went on to say, quote, I have often, in the course of this session, looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know it is a rising and not a setting sun. And of course, if you don't get that, what he's saying is America, the United States of America, was a nation getting ready to come into sunlight. They were getting ready to be something created, not something that was going to fall apart. Let's go back to the material. 3 delegates refused to sign: Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia, along with Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, feared that the new Constitution handed over too much power to the national government. The Constitution's creation began a process in which states had to decide whether to approve the Constitution. Each state would hold a convention to approve or reject the plan for the new government. Once 9 states endorsed it, 9 of the 13, the Constitution would become law. Question number 23. Most Americans know July 4th, 1776 as the date of America's independence. However, another important date in American history is the date that our Constitution was signed. What is that date? September 17th, 1787. Question 24. What are the extremely important first 3 words of the preamble to the United States Constitution? We, the people. Question 25. Summarize how Benjamin Franklin felt about the Constitutional Convention. He felt it was a success. He realized it wasn't perfect. There were some compromises. You know, when you think about the 3/5 compromise, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But overall, Benjamin Franklin saw a rising sun. He saw a country on the rise, not a country that was going to fall apart. Question 26. In order for the Constitution to be ratified, it needed how many of the states to approve it? It needed 9 of the 13 states to agree. Well, to leave you today, I have a meme, and this is about the concept of compromise, and it goes like this. She wanted a puppy, but I didn't want a puppy. So we compromised and got a puppy. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.